Okay, good morning, Dad.
Morning.
Today is Monday, February 17th. How was your weekend?
Not bad.
What were you thinking about? I know a lot happened over the weekend, so what occupied most of your headspace?
Well, of course, there was the poo-poo party, which was obviously the highlight of the weekend. Uh,
Mm,
but anyway, we don't have to get into that. Of course, we're talking about my grandson, your son,
mm.
his potty training success or celebration party. But anyway, uh, yeah, there was a lot to think about just because there's a lot going on in the world right now. Again, momentous shifts, apparently. The world is changing right before our eyes. I think as we speak, um, a delegation led by Lavrov is already in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I don't know if the American delegation has arrived yet, but if it hasn't, it will arrive there soon. And that's composed of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, and then Witkoff. This is to lay the really the lay the ground for the upcoming summit meeting between the presidents of Russia and the United States.
So you say the world is changing right before our eyes. And I think, we can see the progress being made on ending the Ukraine-Russia war, but can you kind of explain what you mean by how the world's changing? Because I think we're seeing something larger, divisions between Europe and the US, or just the movement to the multipolar world. So how do you see the world changing?
Well, yeah, I guess the biggest news in the last few days is uh, you can say the growing, or I guess I should say the emerging rift between the United States and Europe. And that was signified by, I think more than anything by events at the Munich Security Conference, just that ended just a couple of days ago. Um, yeah, at that conference, Vice President Vance gave quite an extraordinary speech. It was followed by a speech by Zelensky, and I watched both of them in their entirety. And yeah, there was, I think it's for the longest time, ever since 2007, and that's when Putin gave what I think we should regard as a historic speech at the Munich Security Conference again. It was where he declared that, look, this unipolar world is not viable, it's not sustainable. That this effort to maintain Western hegemony has to end. And he was, was described as an angry speech and so on and so forth. And people were very upset. The attendees, I think, were watched him in a kind of a cold fury. Um, but but Putin's Putin. He was actually very, very careful with his words. He was just stating truths, and I think it's just clear everything that he laid out. It would have been good if they had listened to him. If we wouldn't have this war now. We would be in a much better place. Um, but yeah, Vance didn't speak about the multipolar world, but he spoke more about Europe itself. He said that Europe was beginning to betray, its democratic values. I think that more or less is the theme of his speech. He pointed in particular to the case of Romania, which is probably the most egregious case of suppression of, opposition parties and also manipulation of election results. So we've seen that, shenanigans in places like the UK and in France and in other countries too. When the opposing party looks like it's going to win, they pull out all stops and play these games, but they're just barely within the bounds of their own laws to do that. But this was just, was was an egregious anti-democratic move. There's just no question about it. And the fact that there was no condemnation from the other governments, and I think there was a EU official, Thierry, that came out and said that, well, what we did Yeah, so he admitted that the EU was involved in this, and I think there's no question that they applied pressure. That what we did in Romania, we could do in Germany. So in other words, he was also threatening to ban the AfD, as various groups in Germany have been threatening. So anyway, Vance he 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 shined a light on these, and he pointed to other failures, obvious anti-democratic trends and incidents within Europe. And I think he did it actually, I mean, very well. He did it very intelligently. His demeanor was always very calm. Is later described as an angry diatribe, but you didn't sense really any anger. But it was quite forceful. He didn't pull any punches. But he did deliver it in a very calm manner, and he got a few people clap, but there was very little applause. There was quite a bit of applause at the beginning. He was introduced by the organizer of the event, who we can talk about later because of an incident that occurred when the conference ended. The organizer of the whole conference, and in a very friendly way, and everybody was very happy to have Vance there, and there's a lot of clapping. And then at one point he said, "Well, that just may be the last applause I get." And then he started talking, about, hey, Europeans, wake up, look what you're doing. You say that you're defending democracy. You say, that's the kind of the ideological justification for your support, of Ukraine and so on. But look at yourselves. Your greatest enemy isn't Russia, it's yourselves. You are destroying your own democratic civilization. One thing he didn't get into, but I was actually the profound lack of democracy in Ukraine itself. I mean, the hypocrisy is actually much greater than what he described. But he did a very good job of describing, these troubling tendencies and failures of democracy within Europe.
We've always described the European countries as vassals of the United States, the Western European countries. But now that the U.S. itself is taking a different direction completely, they seem to be completely at a loss, like chickens with their head cut off, just running around. How does this work, this relationship work? Because if they don't have their master, we talk about the unipolar moment. The unipolar moment is the United States. If the U.S. itself is recognizing that we're moving away from unipolarity to a multipolar world, it's kind of odd that the Europeans are just sitting there by themselves like, wait, we are still the unipolar hegemon. We are Western hegemony, even though the message coming from Washington, D.C. is contrary to that. So how does that work? What's happening?
No, it's quite an extraordinary set of circumstances. And, one of the immediate reactions, well, it came in Zelensky's speech, which followed. I think it was the day after Vance's speech. And he went on and on about the need for Europe. He was careful not to insult the U.S. or Trump. He had enough sense. He understood that that would be a mistake. But he was essentially saying, look, we're in this together now. Europe has to draw together. It has to be united. And he suggested that they create their own army, a European army, a multinational army. Now NATO is an assemblage of many different national armies, and but he was suggesting that there should be. You say, well, we can do it together. But and you're hearing the same kind of calls from European leaders, from the usual suspects like Macron and Keir Starmer. But that's just not going to work. Let's be honest. Even with the U.S. fully involved, Ukraine has been losing this war, and they're losing it more and more rapidly, because even all the arsenal of the U.S. and of Europe has been pretty much emptied to support Ukraine, and now we're down to there are no more stockpiles. Again, we're drawing from monthly production, and that's just very meager, and it's completely outproduced by Russia. So even with the U.S. involved, they can't do it. They're not able to hold the line. So how possibly could they do it? They're in economic trouble. Their populations are growing increasingly skeptical or even resentful of this Ukraine project. how are they going to do it? I don't think they can. But so they're just, they're pretending that they can. We'll do it. But um, I think they have a profound identity crisis because they've been uh, they assumed that they were faithful servants, faithful devotees of this religion of the international rules-based order. Uh, but now their leader, it appears anyway, it's still early, but it appears that he is abandoning them. He doesn't really like them. I think he's made that clear, and wants to shift resources away. Not just end the flow of arms to Ukraine, but maybe pull troops out of NATO. Um, I don't. They're in a state of shock and of fury, and in some cases, they're breaking down in tears, as the organizer of the Munich Security Conference did. The one who introduced Vance at the end, he had to give the final speech, the kind of the farewell address, and he broke down in tears at the end of his speech, just as he was talking about their beloved rules-based international order. So on one level, it's the thing that they have identified themselves appears to be breaking apart. That's quite dramatic. Now, so what are they going to do? Is there going to be a European army? I don't think so, to be honest. Poland has already spoken against it, and Poland would actually be able to contribute probably more than any other Western European country. But they're not Western European, but a European country. But now they've called together or convened these emergency conferences, or meetings. One in Paris, Macron did, and I think Italy, Germany, the UK, Poland, and apparently some other countries are going to be there too. And then a similar conference has been convened in Brussels, by the EU leadership. And so far you don't see any signs like waking up. Wait a second, maybe we should listen to Vance. Maybe he has something to say, or maybe this whole thing was stupid. You're not hearing any of that. There's just sort of a circling of the wagons and this insistence that, we're Europe, and this is what we're about. Okay, our leader has at least temporarily forsaken us, but we will remain true to our cause. I noticed like the contrast between the reception to Vance's speech, which was met generally with silence, I think shocked silence, and Zelensky's speech. His was punctuated by applause, all the old cliches that just made him feel so good. This is what these conferences were about. You get together and you just repeat the old cliches, even when things are obviously the policy that you adopted didn't work, but you don't question it. That's not allowed. That's a Russian talking point or whatever. So you just repeat the cliches and people feel good. They get that warm, fuzzy feeling and they applaud. And they had that with Zelensky. But looking at it, you just had to know that somewhere deep down they said this isn't working, but they just don't know where to go. Yeah, by the way, Zelensky started off his speech with talking about the drone attack on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and said, "This is what the Russians do," And then, like just a few minutes later, he started talking about the North Koreans, and so this is the guy that your savior, the guy that, or at least he's not their savior, but the kind of your raison d'être. This. It's for him that you're fighting. It's for him that you're making all these sacrifices. The charlatan. Well, so yeah, what's going to happen to Europe? Yeah, this is if the U.S. It's not a certain thing. Sometimes, I've seen it in the past. But maybe things really will be different now. That Trump will go charging off in one direction and then reverse himself, or the thing will fall apart. But it looks like he's got some serious people around him, like Vance. Right, who are pushing this. So this is different this time. Now he does have some, I guess he's the president. Before he didn't even have any generals that really agreed with him. Now he has some generals. He has leaders around him who are willing to at least carry out his vision. So what happens to Europe? One possibility, well, maybe they could wake up and take the practical route, and just say, look, we've done some stupid things. There actually are some people are now talking about, hey, maybe this could be good. We could get cheap energy again and revitalize our industries. Maybe it's the time to actually realize that initial vision that, of a European superpower, that's independent of the U.S. and can be there, one of the great poles in this multipolar world. And you aren't quite hearing that yet, but that's maybe they could go down that route. The other possibility is they could just retreat more deeply into their own delusions. Part of like what we've talked about is this sense of moral purity to explain their behavior. When the consequences of their actions were so destructive, to themselves, like the cutting off gas in general, the energy links between themselves and Russia. It makes no practical sense, no economic sense, but it's sort of a matter of moral purity. I'm reminded of, I think it was a statement, I'm sure it was more than one person, but in the Swedes some years ago started to refer themselves to it as a moral superpower. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe our industry is dying and our master has abandoned us, but we're the moral superpower. And they could just go, kind of cling. And I'm sure some of them are that seems to be the initial reaction. They're trying to hang on to that. But I don't know how long it's going to work. At some point, it's just reality has a way of breaking in. And these various populist groups may eventually, carry out a revolution in Europe. We'll see. But and it'll be harder. I'd have to say the establishment, if indeed, the U.S. pulls away, the establishment there is going to be greatly weakened. That's part of, what gave them strength was the support from the U.S. that they could always rely on, and now they can't rely on it anymore. So, it looks better for, let's say, the revolutionaries, so-called, in Europe now.
Right. Right. I think there seems to be a general acknowledgement, though, that this is kind of the end, because just you say about the person that organized the conference crying at the end in his farewell. There's been talks just saying that we have to acknowledge that there is a divorce between Europe and the U.S. in terms of our fundamental values, I believe is what they said. And so this is, in a sense, kind of an acknowledgement that things are different. And in the short term, maybe they're thinking, like you said, they're ideologues. They're going to go down with the ship, that this is it. But really, Western hegemony is over. They're going to go down with it instead of making a change. But there's going to be, clearly, I believe this will give huge support to the opposition parties, to the AfD, to Gorgescu in Romania, probably the National Rally, because all of a sudden the whole basis of the EU establishment was that we were part of this rules-based order led by the United States. Like we said, now they're like chickens with their heads cut off. They just have to run around desperately throwing together these little conferences, doing kind of crazy last gasp type of actions. Keir Starmer was saying that potentially the UK would be sending 25,000 troops to Ukraine. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
And so this type of activity just seems like the actions of a dying ideology right now in Europe.
Uh-huh.
This is all they have left, so they just have to try something. But it's done. I just imagine in the next couple of years, as these elections come on, all these establishment parties will lose pretty heavily at the ballot box because their leader's gone. That's
it. Yeah, no, it is a great blow to the establishment there. One thing they could rely on is we've had this American-led system ever since the end of World War II, and that's what's made they can make the argument. That's what made us prosperous. Let's not change anything. We need to follow our American leaders. Now, of course, it's become more extreme in the last couple of decades. And places like, countries like France used to exercise a fair amount of independence. So it's a more recent phenomenon, the subservience to the U.S. in France, and it's become more extreme everywhere. But I think in general, like sort of the average citizen, the one who votes for a center right or a center left party and is afraid of these rising opposition parties, their thinking is like, my parents and my grandparents, they always voted for this party because this has been safe. It's been good for Europe, and America's leadership has been good for Europe. I think clearly it hasn't been good for Europe in the last several years, but that's it's just that there's this inertia, these really deep, long, these this relationship and this trust that's been engendered is something that goes across over generations, and it just doesn't disappear overnight, or even in a matter of years sometimes. But this will be a blow to it, because if America really does leave in a significant way, those average citizens, that again always vote for the establishment parties, I think they now have a license to actually look at the populist party. You say it's just like the old order has fallen. I was always supporting the old order. I just didn't want to hear any criticism of it. But it's gone. So what are these people really representing anymore? They're talking this crazy talk about us being a moral superpower, or they won't use that language exactly, but I think that's part of what they're doing. Or we're going to create our own army or something. It's all a lot of nonsense, and I think a lot of people will see through it.
Right. I was just kind of thinking, do you think that maybe the reason that the elites are in such a panic when Trump talked to Putin is that they know that they are fueling a false narrative? This idea of Ukraine being a democracy, and that this was a completely unprovoked attack. That if people start talking to the Russians, then you would have to hear their side of the story. And once you hear their side, it's so rational where they're coming from. You're actually just kind of surprised that they were so patient, that they put up with the ruse of Minsk 1 and 2 and the suppression of the Russian language and the bombing of the civilians in the Donbass for 8 years. And it just, there's no legs. The narrative that's built around Ukraine is just completely false once you start diving into it. And so if somebody in the West starts talking to Putin, then that narrative starts to seep through into their country. And I think maybe that's what they're just so scared of, because just everything we've been fed over the past 3 years, unprovoked Russian aggression over and over again. And you just can't talk. Nobody talk to Putin. No, but we stand strong and we'll support Ukraine to the end. Do you think that they know that they're actively willing participants of this lie, but they're willing to do it because it's for some higher cause in their cult minds?
Yeah, it's hard to really get into the mind of somebody like that who's so deeply deluded. How much is, let's say, self-awareness is there? How much of it is conscious? I think maybe in the case of some people that there is a fair amount of awareness, but I think in most people that they bought into it. They really believe the narrative. Sometimes it's a narrative they themselves have helped to create, but but is a narrative that is very much based on the demonization of Putin, the Russian government, and even all of Russia. And if you really convince yourself that this is the devil incarnate, then you can't talk to him, and it's you're possibly you yourself will be infected with evil if you talk with him. That's the kind of thinking that you see. It's and certainly the rhetoric that you hear. So it's just a very terrifying thought. You say, okay, well, oh no, our master is talking to the devil. That's kind of how they look at it, right?
Right. It just to me, it just sort of hammers home how fake this whole thing is with the support for Ukraine. If one phone call can just tear the whole thing down, it's just like there wasn't anything real here to begin with. Our cause supporting Ukraine was just false from the beginning. It was more than false; it was manufactured. It's It
Yeah,
just
well,
it's just crazy to me that it's just
yeah.
if it just laid out, there's always nuance, and there's gray areas, but here it almost feels like there's not a lot.
Yeah,
It's just we were
it's
in the
always so.
wrong with this. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Well,
but
yeah. Well, certainly on the level. I mean, there was, especially at the beginning. Okay, there was a great deal of calculation, right? It's just that they said, they knew that the conflict was about to break out, and they were quite happy about that because they thought it was their chance to destroy Russia. That's what the leaders of the collective West were thinking. It's clear. And immediately they slapped on these very severe sanctions, and they expressed a great deal of confidence. Of course, it was going to destroy Russia. They were going to destroy him militarily and economically, and they didn't, right? But it was so the problem is that, okay, well, what do? You reassess and say, oh, oops, we made a big mistake. No, in creating this attack on Russia, part of it, of course, was a very big part of it was soft power. It was the narrative, and so they did intensely demonize Putin. They had been working on that, of course, over years. So it's not like they weren't building on anything, but they took it to a whole new level. And I think the problem with these narratives, if you invest so much in them, you can become a victim of your own narrative. And I think that's where they are.
yeah, it's just amazing. It was just built on sand, and the whole thing is just sinking. It doesn't take much to destroy this narrative, and
Yeah.
that's why I believe, we just weren't allowed to talk to Putin, talk to the Russians, is just because we couldn't. They would just. I think people knew it would destroy the narrative, but now that it's been done, now that Trump has talked to Putin, and we're going to have the negotiations in Saudi Arabia. Do you think that we'll see more leaders willing to, make a phone call, and then everything will just start to change?
Yeah,
I
there's
feel
the
like everything's
potential,
changing.
right? It's just like, again, there was this consensus, like during the Biden administration. And to be honest, even during the first Trump administration, he came in, talking about dismantling NATO and that kind of thing. So there was a great deal of fear. But the people that he appointed just kept things running the way they were. And in fact, NATO expanded, and arms were sent into Ukraine. Nothing really changed. So there was this sigh of relief. Um, but clearly things are different this time. Let's see, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to. Um, what was your question again? I'm sorry.
I was just saying, if people start making phone calls to Putin
Okay.
now and just break down the
Right.
narrative,
Okay.
just to.
Right. So this is the thing: is that before we had this consensus, and it's a consensus that was all, it not only existed in the Biden administration, but in previous administrations, including the first term of Donald Trump. So there's this powerful consensus, and it takes a very brave person, somebody like a Viktor Orban or a Robert Fico, to break that consensus. And most, let's be honest, the vast majority of Western politicians just don't have that in them. But if the consensus is broken, I think you do. Then gaps begin to open. That people who maybe leaders, politicians that were reluctant to go against the consensus, they see the consensus has been greatly weakened, and there are new opportunities um, you know, for new movements, a whole new way of doing things. So I think it's too early. This is just like everybody's in a state of shock, but down the road, I think we will see a lot of challenges to the establishment in Europe.
Mhm. Now, last night I was just thinking, I was lying in bed, like everything I've been told has been a lie. I just grew up just thinking how virtuous America was, how great it was to be an American, and that we were number one, and that we were saving the world, and this beacon of democracy and light. And then I never learned about neocon thinking, what a neocon was. We were never taught that in school.
Mhm.
We never realized that our system of the world is that we stay number one by making sure that we put everybody else down unless they subscribe to us, our ideology completely, that this is our thinking. And it just, you have to be subservient to us or you're the enemy, essentially, is kind of, I feel like what we become. And it just, I'm wondering, like, has it always been like this? Have we always had this lie? It's not a good feeling to realize that, come to that conclusion, like, hey, we're the bad guys, you know. You don't want to
Yeah.
believe that.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's kind of what Europe might be going through, that as well, to go through that kind of that identity crisis. You've been through something, part of something, that thinking that you're part of the Western civilization, the beacon of light, and then come to realize, like, hey, this was just all fake. This was all a lie. And it's like you're leaving your cold, coming out of the cave, and it's a little scary at first, but it's, you know, it's just, everything is just seemed to be propaganda here. Everything just,
Yeah. Well, I think it's
I don't know what to believe.
Yeah. Well, I think in recent years it really, is, that we've gone down the wrong road. And, what happens, of course, you go down the wrong path or you commit yourself to a false cause. There are really two main options. You can say, oops, I made a mistake, and you turn around and you go back. But the more common, unfortunately, the more common choice is, or not, it's not really a conscious choice, but let's say just reaction, is to double down and to hunker down and to begin to lash out. Because if you really have committed to something that's false, then the world becomes much scarier. It's just like you become afraid of reality itself. You can't let it intrude because you've committed to this vision. It's virtuous. It's good. It's true. And these people out there are saying these things, and it gives you a sense of real insecurity because maybe deep down you know that what they're saying is true. So what you do is you just demonize them and you lash out. And you become increasingly shrill and narrow-minded. And I think that's what we've seen. It's just that we went down a wrong path here over the last couple of decades, particularly. And it's taken us to really a dead end. Now, has it always been this way? I would say no. I mean, I just remember as a child and, in my early adulthood during the Cold War years, we were supposed to be the free world. Now, maybe that was exaggerated, and you could point out to a lot of hypocrisies, and to some extent, the Soviet Union was demonized, but not demonized to the extent that Russia is now in the West. When in fact Russia, by our own standards, is a much freer, happier, more prosperous place than it was under the Soviet Union. Back in the old days, there was quite a bit of, I think, truth in general. Again, you don't want to take this too far. There were certainly dark chapters, like in the Cold War struggle on the Western side, but in general, truth was on our side in general. So there was a greater confidence, and there wasn't really a fear of, for example, Soviet propaganda. There was some, but it was not like now, these efforts to just shut down, any sort of, well, certainly like RT, Russian supported media, but more than that, attack people who actually repeat or take the same position that the Russian government says on anything. In general, that just wasn't true. Maybe it was true back in the 50s, but like in the 70s and 80s, the time that I remember, we had a confidence. We didn't worry about Russian propaganda, Soviet propaganda back then. In fact, we would make fun of it because, we knew that it was they, in general, that had to suppress news and protect their people from knowing the truth because things really weren't going well. They were becoming relatively less prosperous, and they certainly were less free than we were, and we knew it. And so we were, we didn't have that fear, and there wasn't really this need to demonize the other side. And in fact, we succeeded in drawing up a lot of very important treaties that made the world more secure because we in fact respected them as other, as real human beings and not as devils. So things have changed. They have changed for the worse in that regard.
Do you think that the West is the most propagandized society in the world?
Yeah, I don't really know what's going on in North Korea now, to be honest.
Okay,
But
well, we'll
yeah,
take North
yeah,
Korea
yeah,
out. That doesn't
yeah.
count, I think.
Um, I think, well, my sense, I don't consume, I don't know Russian, so I don't consume Russian media, but I try to understand what's going on there. And of course, your sister is there, and she tells us a lot. Um, the Russians themselves, they just don't seem to invest very much at all in the information war. They don't. Often they can make a much better argument, it seems to me, but they don't. It's just like they have their policies and then they explain it in actually a very intellectual way that maybe a lot of people don't really grasp. The perfect example, of course, was Putin in his interview with Tucker Carlson. Um, that's a Russian way. They just don't. Yeah, they really don't do propaganda, or if they do it, they don't do it very well at all. But we do. We're very good at it. And I think that's the Russians themselves said, we just don't even try to compete with them. We just try to live in reality and pursue our own objectives. But yeah, I think people don't realize there's this assumption, again, it's just sort of, you get very smug and comfortable. We've been prosperous, we've been free, we're the free world. And so you get a lot of people. Now, obviously, that's a shrinking percentage of the population throughout the West, but you get a lot of people, and in a lot of countries, it's the majority that just trust the mainstream media and just can't imagine that they would be lying to them. But many of us have discovered that they have. So, in places like the U.S., I think the majority just doesn't believe the mainstream media anyway. For most people, for us, it's mainly foreign policy, but for a lot of people, it's usually the majority of them is the domestic political questions. They realize that they were lied to, and they go elsewhere. It doesn't mean that they necessarily find the truth elsewhere, but they become skeptical of the mainstream.
Is that what it was like during the Soviet Union? People knew that, Pravda or whatever, that this was propaganda, and
Yeah,
people looked at it but knew it was fake. Is that
yeah.
kind of where we're at now?
Well, no, it's a little different. I remember actually, I read quite a bit about the Soviet Union back in those days. That like the average Soviet citizen knew that there was a great deal of propaganda in the news that they read, and or consumed in one way or another. But they would learn to read between the lines. It's like, oh, this is a propaganda sentence. Hey, this is probably real here. There was sort of they developed these analytical skills. They were very, very good at kind of figuring out what was really going on. Um, Now, I remember this was even back, still in the Cold War years in the 1980s. But um, I remember, reading about Soviet citizens who had emigrated to the United States or to another Western country. And I remember them commenting, these Soviet citizens, that they considered Westerners to be very naive. They very trustingly consumed everything that was presented to them. Now, maybe like back in those days, it was 90% true or 80% true or something. So, but they would just swallow it whole, and they just didn't have that skepticism that had been actually very active, had been fostered, within the Soviet citizenry. A lot of them had learned to be very, very skeptical, and to be actually um, not simply to trust these media outlets. And so when they got to the U.S., they actually said these people are very naive. They just believe everything they read, and they carried that skepticism with them and that analytical skill. So it was different because there wasn't. I think what we have now in the West, like in the U.S., is that we're breaking apart into kind of different political communities where we have our own sources of information. That wasn't possible in the Soviet Union. with the exception of, you know, samizdat, these kind of unofficial publications, but that reached very, very few people. We're talking like, I think, less than 1%. But in the U.S., there are people who just inhabit different, you could say, information spaces, and it used to be one information space in the U.S. Now it's breaking apart. Hopefully, overall, we have become more skeptical and are kind of developing that same, those analytical skills. You have to. I think it's always a mistake. Over time, I feel like I found some sources that are reliable. I used to trust different sources, and I found, this person isn't reliable. It's not like, everybody makes mistakes. People make bad predictions, or predictions that turn out. We all do. That's going to happen, but you need to acknowledge them when they do. And over time, I would find, okay, well, this person really is not reliable. Is not a good source of information. But I feel like I found a good, reliable sources. That's what we can do now, in the current information landscape. There's a lot out there, and I think a lot of, you can find people that really are reliable and give you a very realistic picture of what's going on. So, yeah, but yeah, again, it's whereas you had like in the Soviet Union, you had this one unified information environment, very carefully and thoroughly controlled by the central government. But the citizenry had learned to kind of read between the lines. Here we have a fracturing of that information environment, and we're finding ourselves kind of on different continents. And we'll see where that leads us.
Yeah, it makes it difficult to to have conversations and make friends when you go to the bar or something. It's like, well, what information space does this person occupy? Because
right.
You might be on a completely different planet, so you gotta be careful.
Yeah, right. We've all had our experiences.
Yeah, that's why I pay attention to sports, because that's one of those things you can just bring up. So, hey, we can talk about that, right? We can talk about football instead.
Yeah.
It's a strange situation we're in. Sometimes I wonder if there's a risk, how people occupy these information spaces, because obviously we're in our own information space. Yeah. I'm sure, what we listen to, and I'm sure what our viewers are listening to, everybody knows Judging Freedom, Alexander Mercouris, Scott Ritter, Pepe Escobar. We have that same group. And I'm wondering, is there, I believe what they're saying is true, just because their predictions and we see what plays out and you follow them over time and realize it's true. But I'm wondering, if we occupy this information space too much, are we missing out on something else that we should be paying attention to? Because I don't want to get too close that this becomes my world, and then I'm on this continent and I'm not jumping off exploring other continents. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think it's important, like, to every once in a while, like, to put to sample, let's say, the fare from another information space. And, I try to do that. I probably should do it even more, but like, I do read daily reports from the New York Times and even the Huffington Post. I think it's important to do that, just to kind of to at least understand or get a sense of what other people are thinking. You may disagree with it, but to let them express themselves in their own terms. There's a danger. I'll give you, I noticed something, like, before I listened to the Zelensky speech, that I had read a lot of reports on the speech, and it was interpreted. And then after, it was given a certain spin. And now this is within, let's say, our information space. And it was, I almost got the sense that he was basically attacking Trump. I think that was really an incorrect interpretation of what he did. I didn't see that. When I watched the speech itself, I got a different sense. No, it seemed really nutty in some ways. The whole thing was, but it didn't have the tone that somehow I started to imagine by reading these reports on it. So I think when you can, and often we just don't have the time, but when we can, we should go to the original. listen to the actual speech, rather than just relying on comments or analysis of the speech or the document, whatever it would maybe. No, I know, we only have so many hours in the day, but it's something like just a reality check. It's just every once in a while, uh, go to the source, spend the time to listen to the whole speech or to read the whole document. And, that will, I think can maybe prevent us from becoming, again, sort of uh, enclosed within our own bubbles.
Hmm.
And, because even with I think any group, even any movement or that may be founded on a truth, let's say in opposition to some evil establishment or whatever, there's always a potential among human beings to just kind of to go awry, to veer away from the truth and start to just reinforce certain beliefs at the expense of reality. So you just have to guard against it. And there's no way that we can wake up every morning and be completely skeptical and just try. The only way to live is you eventually you do need to trust a certain number of people and see that these people have earned my trust. But every once in a while, I'll do a little kind of like an audit. I'll step outside and read the documents, listen to the actual speech, read an article from one of these opposition papers, and just to make sure that these people who earned my trust earlier should continue to earn my trust.
In the last program we did, you said that what Trump was doing was kind of, in the past 3 weeks, were just really the opening shots against this battle against the deep state. Can you maybe explain a little bit what you view as this battle against the deep state? Who are the belligerents? I mean, are like the elite in Europe? Are they part of that deep state that can fight back? What is this war? Can you help me define it? What's the major players? How do they attack? What can we expect?
Yeah. Well, domestically, you could say that it's not this simple, but in large part, he's going after those people that sabotaged his first term. He understood at the end of that term that his own government had gone after him, and tried to bring him down. And it became even more obvious afterwards. There was the lawfare, and so when he came back, I think it needs to be pointed out actually how stupid it was of the establishment to do what they did. I think if they had actually treated him nicely, they could have really could have tamed him. No, I think because he showed that tendency. He wanted to be friends with these people. That's sort of his tendency. If they had actually kind of worked with them and kind of worked with them, but then gradually pushed them in different directions and praised them, and they never launched these attacks on them like the Russiagate hoax or the impeachment proceedings or any of these things that we know so well. You could have they wouldn't have the monster in the White House that they have now. They helped to create that monster. And here he is. And they made these conflicts personal for him. Before he had some ideas, but he could have been talked out of them. But now, because he went after him the way you did in the first term, it's become personal. And for Trump, I think that's very important. That's a good, explains not everything. You don't want to overstate this, but it explains a lot of what he does. He has, he likes certain people, he doesn't like other people, and he acts accordingly. I think that's very different from Putin, by the way. Putin's able to set that aside and just look at, rationally at national interest and proceed accordingly. I think that's probably true of Xi Jinping too, but that's not the person that Trump is. They've made it personal, and so a lot of what he's doing is cleaning house. Is just he understands, and I think correctly, that there are a lot of people, within the bureaucracy that he oversees as the chief executive, a lot of people who were out to get him, who are his enemies, and they truly are. So he's doing what he can to clean house. That's a big part of it. And then it extends overseas. He knows that, particularly in the UK, part of the Russia hoax was manufactured right there in the UK. There was the Steele dossier, and then the current prime minister, of course, actually sent some of his underlings to the U.S. to work on behalf of Kamala Harris, which was incredibly stupid, But again, they've made themselves enemies. So, yeah, that's part of it is personal, but he clearly has his ideas, and he's had them all his life, and part of it is this America first, which means that he just doesn't see the need to maintain a global empire. I think he kind of likes the idea of being, the most powerful man in the world. I think that's clear, and that's could be a dangerous side of his personality. But he doesn't. He's not a neocon. He doesn't. He doesn't really care if the Chinese are Chinese or the Russians are Russians, and they don't do things exactly the way they are. He feels no need to carry out this revolution in every country. And he knows, from it was clear that even those countries, those leaders in Europe who maybe didn't actively fight him like Keir Starmer did, but he knows that they don't like him. I mean, they made it clear in the months leading up to his election whose side they were on, and he remembers it. So. Again, I don't want to say that it was all personal, but I think in a good part it is.
So if he destroys the deep state, does that in effect destroy Western hegemony as well? Is that part of it, can we say?
Well, it's certainly part of it, yeah, because, I mean, that's...
USAID, right? USAID is an example.
Yeah, exactly. They're a regime change organization, and, these other NED, and most question about it. If he truly does dismantle them, and he's gone a long, ways down that. We'll see. The establishment has ways of fighting back, and there are constitutional questions so far. But he's already done a lot of damage to those globalist institutions.
Yeah, how can they fight back? Because to me, it just feels like the deep state's on the run right now, and it's great to see, that because if we're saying that this is also destroying Western hegemony, we can maybe have a peaceful world in the future if we can uproot all this. So how would they fight back?
Yeah. The intelligence agencies can, have a way of manipulating the information landscape. Now, of course, I think they're finding that more and more difficult for the reasons that we're just describing. Before you can stage certain events, like the Russiagate hoax was that. It was something, these information, it was information that turned out often to be untrue or had to, or spun in a certain way or whatever, but they would leak information and to build this hysteria against Trump. And I think that, by abusing that power, and it makes it harder for them to do that again. It just, occasionally you see efforts to link him to Trump, Trump to Putin, and you still see that, of course those attacks are made, but they just don't seem to have the impact that they used to have. And it's not pursued with the same kind of energy. And I think it's because, again, what we're saying about the fracturing of the larger information environment. So, it works within your establishment information bubble. Maybe it doesn't even work so well there, but, at least you don't get any counter arguments there. And people consume your information, and maybe they don't believe it as much as they did, but they did. But now you have these larger kind of skeptical or alternative information communities, and they're not even hearing you. So it just doesn't work as well. So those kind of operations, it's not like they're going to stop, and they will still have some impact, but just not nearly as much. There's always a chance of false flags, But again, if you have the president and he's in charge and he has smart people around him, those false flags could be exposed. So it's tougher. Again, they're imaginative things that we haven't thought of that might be true. But one thing I do get the sense, both in Europe and America, is that like the establishment, again, they had that aura of invincibility for the longest time because they've been there for such a long time. And even when Trump came in this first time, they essentially kind of contained him. And so you had this sense, well, nobody can really overthrow the establishment. But that was, in a way, may have been their greatest strength. It's just that if there is this aura of invincibility, say, what's the point of attacking? I'll just be, if I go after the establishment, I'll just become the establishment's next victim. But when that aura of invincibility goes, then a lot of people say, hey, these people are not invincible. They can be defeated, and the opposition becomes energized.
Right. The pitchforks are out for the establishment.
Yeah. So it is a whole new world. We'll see. And then also, you think about, like, for example, what the Democrats put up against Trump. Now, Trump is a very flawed person, but what the Democrats had, they had somebody who was literally suffering from dementia, President Biden. And then Kamala Harris, who was just a real non-entity. That was the best they could do. You just sort of realize that they're fundamentally kind of empty and weak. And I think you see that through much of Europe too. These people are there's a reason that their own populations just don't have no love for them. Sometimes they vote for them out of habit, but they're really often very kind of empty people, pathetic, what they had going for them was they're part of this invincible establishment. But then when that again is that aura begins to fade, they're just revealed for what they are. And they're not really don't seem to be very formidable at all.
So it sounds like you're saying that the deep state really doesn't have a lot left, to be honest. They kind of fired most of their salvo, and now their munitions are low too here. The gig is up. So, I mean, should we pop the champagne and say that, okay,
it's not over. I think it's, one of the things that I worry about is just with Trump that he may self-destruct in some ways. Again, I cheer on a lot of what he's doing, but then I think, for example, this trade war is really very, very dangerous and could be economically destructive, and it could come back to bite him in a big way. It could bring on a recession or spark, significant inflation, and his popularity could dry up pretty quickly. And even if the opposition is pathetic, they can take advantage of that. That's one example. And then, I'm very happy about these negotiations. It's wonderful that they're talking, and there are all kinds of things that can be done. But I still think it's unlikely. I hope it happens. I really do. But I think it's unlikely that they'll negotiate a settlement to this war. And what will happen when, finally you get to the point, Trump has been kind of boasting that he's going to get this done. And, he keeps on giving different time frames, but it's always in the not so distant future, that it becomes clear he can't, or he feels like he can't. I think it would be actually very wise for him to accept Putin's terms and end the war, on Putin's terms. But it's going to be hard for him to do that, maybe personally or just because of opposition among his advisors or whatever. And then, well, the Ukrainians have outright said that if they're not part of it, they're not going to abide by the agreement. So, this whole thing is still very doubtful, still very much up in the air. And if it falls apart, I think, the Russians will just keep on marching west, and they can march faster and faster. And then we can have a whole new crisis, and maybe, potentially like a complete reversal on the part of Trump if they start heading towards Odessa and Kiev or something. He doesn't want to be seen as weak. That's part of him. He made a lot of hay out of Biden's Afghanistan failure, and he doesn't want to have the same thing pinned on him. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong. Don't get me wrong. It's great, what's happened so far. And so there's reasons to be hopeful where there were no reasons before. But we're a long ways from the finish line.
If he wants to get this agreement, I mean, it sounds like you think the biggest threat to torpedoing this negotiation is just going to be the pressure coming from the West. And I try to spend 15, 20 minutes watching BBC and CNN, and I could see the narrative that they're pushing, that how, Ukraine and Europe must be at the table, and They never acknowledge anything, any of the reasons why Russia started this SMO to begin with. But if Trump and Vance start explaining the rationale behind the Russians, I think then everything changes very quickly. So do you think that's possibly what will happen?
Yeah.
That they'll just be able to say, like, look, these were the agreements with Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Here's the Istanbul agreement that was torn up. This is, everything, we're for human rights and the suppression of the Russian language, banning the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Zelensky is no longer actually the legal president of Ukraine because his term expired of May last year. There is no democracy, suppressing opposition parties, not allowing alternative, opposition media, anything like this. There's an endless amount of ammunition to destroy the Ukrainian regime and this idea that we are supporting democracy. So it seems to me very easy to actually, to just, like I said, the narrative it's all fake. You can you can tear the whole thing down so easily.
Right.
And if they just go that route, then I think it's over. Then once people, because the reality is, we are in our information continent, like you said, and we understand what's going on. Our listeners understand what's going on. But 95% of the world, or of the Western world, or 90%, I don't know, haven't even heard these things. They don't even know. They just hear over and over again, unprovoked, invasion, completely unprovoked invasion into Ukraine, and Putin's assassinated Navalny in his prison, and all these things, just nonstop,
Right.
And I just feel like if the Trump team takes that route, then it's game over. Do you think so?
I think you're right. Again, we've argued earlier that the narrative is just such a big part of the whole picture that it can't be ignored. You can't just go ahead and negotiate agreement and leave the false narrative intact. And I think, again, that was one of the mistakes that the Obama administration made when they negotiated the JCPOA with Iran. Iran was evil, but we made this, and they're a bunch of madmen who want to destroy the world, or, a good part of it. They didn't fight it. So it was easy for opponents of the agreement to tear it up, and Trump himself did that. So it's the same thing here. Okay, they're going to negotiate, but I agree. They need to go after the narrative as part of their negotiation strategy. And I believe they can do it because they really do have the facts on their side. And we've seen some of it, some things that Trump has said, Vance didn't really shine a light on Ukraine or Russia, but he shined a light on Europe, that he exposed their hypocrisy, and that was part of it. That's part of what they need to do. So I think they need to go after that in a big way, and there will be a lot of howls of protests, but they just need to stick to their guns. And again, it would be much better for the U.S. and for Ukraine if we got this deal, if he accepted Putin's terms, and he just stops with the 4-0 plus Crimea. And, the Ukrainians are now saying, the Europeans are now saying, if we're not at the table, we can't support it. But in the end, without the U.S., the truth is they really don't have a chance. So they just, I think he just called their bluff. And so it could be done. It could be done, but you have to, I don't think you can take half measures. Like you say, you just go say, hey, look, let's be honest, these are a bunch of crooks. They're not even democratic, this whole thing. And this is something that Trump should like to do, pin it on Biden, and rightly so. Just say this was a really stupid venture by Biden. The whole thing was false. He lied to you. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. And of course, there will be a lot of people in the U.S. that are going to be very angry about it. But I think the majority, you say, what are we sending our money over there for? This doesn't have anything to do with us. So he could do it.
Right. There's so much howling about that. Of course, Ukraine needs to be part of these peace talks, this negotiation. And the fact that they're not there and is causing a lot of distress amongst the West. And I can understand for the uninformed viewer, or not even necessarily so uninformed, but just if you're looking at it superficially, it's like, well, that's crazy. How can Ukraine not be there? They're the one. This is their war, right? They're fighting this. So how would you attack that narrative, that statement? Like, why shouldn't Ukraine not be there? Shouldn't they be there? What would you say?
Well, I would say that first of all, they are completely dependent on us. And so, I mean, when you just kind of give up, you make yourself completely dependent on another power. The truth is, you have to give up a lot of your own sovereignty, and they've done that. You just can't pretend like, oh, it's up to them. It's not up to them because we're actually empowering them to do this. And if we walk away, they can't. So it really isn't their choice. And then also you point out that their president was not democratically elected. This regime that's in power is is an authoritarian regime that has suppressed all the. Even if you do have the elections, it's not going to be fair because all kinds of political parties have been banned in the country, and then all kinds of media outlets have been banned. Many of them have been. Just all the leftist parties, all the Eastern Ukrainian parties, they've all been banned, and any party that just completely didn't toe the line, even pro-Maidan, pro-Western kind of media organizations and parties have been banned because they're just not faithful enough to Zelensky and his gang. You say, these people don't really represent Ukraine. Yeah, they don't have a right to be at the table.
Right. I think that's what the Trump administration needs to do.
Mm-hmm.
When they're being accused constantly of like, how can you not bring Ukraine to the table? They need to say that, well, Zelensky has no legal standing as the president. He is not democratically elected. There have been no elections, and point out, like you said, the arresting of opposition parties, the suppression of all opposition media, that does not represent Ukraine. Zelensky is not speaking on behalf of Ukrainians. That needs to come out. And I don't know. Do you think that why don't they do that? I mean, that
Well,
seems like the
yeah,
clear answer to
right.
when they say like why can't we? Zelensky needs to be in the conversation. We need to have Ukraine. And
Yeah.
then when they're asked that question, it seems like I heard Kellogg. I'm not sure. I heard somebody else, but maybe it was Rubio. They're just like, well, of course, Ukraine is going to be
Yeah.
involved in some way, but they don't really explain
Yeah.
how or why. Instead of
Right.
just saying like, no, look. We need to have a
Right.
free and fair election. We're about democracy. We need to have a free and fair election in Ukraine, right? This is not the legal. Even if you did reach a negotiation, you could argue that the negotiation with Ukraine isn't valid because you don't have a legal president
Mm-hmm.
that has a mandate to make this decision.
Right.
This is
Right.
a dictator that does not have any
Right.
legal right to be president.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you're completely right. Yeah, I think a problem with a lot of politicians or anybody who's making an argument is quite often to win friends to your side. You often concede a lot of points. It's like, of course, like, yeah, I think like you. It's just that we need to do this, and the danger of that is you can concede too much, and I think that's what they're doing. It's just like it, you don't want to. There's a fear of appearing too radical. So sometimes, okay, you've actually gone through and made some breakthroughs and stated some unwelcome truths, but you feel like to prevent the opposition from characterizing you as some wild-eyed radical or Putin puppet, you end up making all these other concessions. I think we're talking about that earlier, like in the case of Tucker Carlson or whatever. I mean, he has gone a long ways, much to his credit, but he still feel like the need to okay, at least maintain the conversation. I got to pretend that I do believe in some of these, but I think that's a mistake because again, you are the president. You are the administration. You can reset this narrative. You can tear down the old one and create a new one. Now there will be a lot of opposition initially, but I think a lot of people were misinformed, and when they find out that they're misinformed, they'll be with you. And other people just kind of go whichever the wind blows, and if they see the wind's blowing this way, they'll start repeating your talking points. So I think they should do it. I think they should that's really their only chance. they need to throw caution to the winds and take advantage of this moment and actually just tear down that whole narrative.
Okay, well, fingers crossed, and let's hope it happens. I was going to talk a little bit about the Middle East. I don't know how are you feeling? You want to do one more question? Or you want to end it here?
Yeah, maybe we'll just end it here. I think
Okay,
we're
all
about
right, that's
an hour,
fine.
aren't we? Okay.
Yeah, we're over an hour already.
Okay.
Okay, all right, well, we'll stop here. Okay, have a good rest of your day, Dad.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.